Today for Fantastical Fictions, we're going to welcome Robert Jackson Bennett, who's been writing many novels in the fantastical vein. And I guess I'll start out with a quick rundown of your bona fides here, your books, past and present. We have, you started, partially because this is going to feed into some of the questions I have. So you started with Mr. Shivers, which won the Shirley Jackson Award and the British Fantasy Award for Best Newcomer.
Right.
And that's set in the Dust Bowl, where a man goes, pursues the murder of his daughter to find out that this Mr. Shivers is a little more than human, I would say. Then we go to the Company Man, which won the Edgar Award and a special citation from the Philip K. Dick Award. Now I have not read that one, but I've heard it billed as steampunk noir alternate history.
Sure.
Set in the early 20th century with elements of science fiction and Union gangster sort of history. The Troupe, with a pianist who joins a vaudeville troupe in order to find his father, but finds that the troupe is very unusual. Wherever they happen to tour, the very nature of the world seems to change. And American Elsewhere, which again won the Shirley Jackson Award, which we have.
It's very large.
Here, yes. We're an ex-cop. Inherits her long-dead mother's home in Wink, New Mexico. The closer Mona gets to her mother's past, the more she understands that people of Wink are very different. The Seattle Times said, mad, humorous, gory, and poignant, a sort of mid-20th century retelling of the embodiment of Lovecraftian elder gods by way of the Alamogordo legendary atomic tests. And you're currently writing the Divine Cities trilogy, which is the City of Stairs, the City of Blades, and the forthcoming City of Miracles. And I think we'll save that to talk about as we go. So I want to kick off with, because this is a Fantastical Fictions reading series, and these books mix and match a lot of genres, and the books in the past have done. And there's so many subgenres, science fiction, fantasy, speculative, magical realism. We'll put it all under fantastic literature or fantastic elements. What in that fantastic mode, what do you enjoy writing? What does it accomplish for you?
Just writing pure fantasy? You mean
or just elements that are not real that you're bringing into your books?
I guess I kind of like it for the sorts of thing that Pratchett does, where if you want to talk about hope or faith or the city or guns or whatever, you can literally make it a thing and then you can test it using the beliefs and the rules of this world. I think, and I really draw from Pratchett a lot on that, because although his books are talked a lot in terms of humor, one of the things that I like about him is that he uses his books as an experiment. And because it's pure fantasy, he can set up all the variables as he likes it. And then he runs the experiment to see how people react to this new idea and how this idea works and how people work. And that's kind of the same thing that I like about fantasy.
Okay, yeah. And I want to ask a couple questions about monsters, because I think there's a theme in all of your writing. There seems to be monsters in of some sort in almost everything that you have out there.
Yeah, probably.
And that could just be part of the unreality or the fantastic element. From the Mr. Shivers, it kind of made me think of I don't know if you know the internet, the Slender Man.
Yeah, I heard about that afterwards, and a lot of people were like, is this that? And I was like, I don't really know what that is. I thought it was and I read a little bit about it. It sounds like it was kind of a joke, basically. Someone passed around these photos and it became really popular, but it's taken on a life of its own, apparently. But yeah, I've never heard of it before I wrote the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of a trope, right? That
probably.
Passed around the internet. I mean, I think what...
I mean, so pretty much it's this idea that dudes in black are kind of creepy. And that's it. I mean,
right.
So, I mean, it's got that in common. and that it has,
Right.
and that it, like, it's got the word man, and he's in black, and he's not a great dude.
Right.
And so it does have that in common in it. But yeah, I mean, like, that's a trope. Guys in black, up to no good. Yeah.
Well, and there's sort of an evolution in monsters that I see. So in this book, one of the things I really loved about it is the monsters have their own story.
Yeah.
They have their own lives. They're like a family.
Yeah.
Which takes it beyond just the monster. Did that evolve like organically as you were writing?
Yeah, as I wrote that one, I stopped thinking about it as a book and really started thinking about it as a series of short stories that all connected about this story of the town, where you got to see how the town worked from a lot of different perspectives. Mm-hmm. And you were never quite sure what everyone's nature was or what was happening or what the history was. But the more I wrote about that, the more it felt tragic and also weirdly interesting, and that there's all these beings in this town, and they all want to feel happy and to feel at home and to feel safe and to feel good about their choices, which is stuff that we all want. And they all have the same problems that we do, in that, you know, they've tried very hard, they've sacrificed some stuff to get to where they are, and they feel like they've done everything right, but they're still not very happy. So they're wondering, you know, and one of the themes in the book is that they weren't sure how to be happy, so they looked at us and they said, well, these people look very happy with their houses and their lawns and their kids and their schools. Let's give it a shot. And so they've done the best job they could of trying to mimic us. And it's worked out for them about as well as I think it's worked out for most people.
Right. Which is a way to highlight what
Yeah.
that's a thing we fall into, right?
Right.
It's like if I get the car, then that'll be, and if I get the nicer house, then that's
Right.
where happiness resides.
And that's what's fun about this genre, is that you can take stuff like that and exaggerate it so that you can see the flaws clear. I seem to recall there was some like essay that I read about how artists do self-portraits, and about how a lot of them try to distort their faces and try and see how much of themselves they can distort and still identify themselves as them. Because if they get to that point, then they'll see what's actually them, like what makes me me. Because if I change everything except for these three things, and I still see myself in them, then those three things are what makes me me. So it's that sort of a thing, but with monsters.
Okay. Yeah, I liked it. I know there was a lot of comparisons to, and I definitely see the Cthulhu-esque, you know, kind
Right.
of thing. To me, it read a little bit like an Alice in Wonderland for grown-ups, because
Sure.
you send Mona into this landscape and it keeps changing and she keeps having to make sense of the world. One of the things I really like is you make it, and I think this is partly, there's a lot of noir and sort of a little, the fast pace of like a good pulp novel, is that you keep things going at such a clip that you're like,
There's a
oh,
lot
of course,
yeah.
of course there's monsters, you know, of course they have these feelings, or of course they, so I think that really works. And then the Divine Cities, you sort of have monsters, but they're more, it's, hence the Divine Cities, right? You bring in religion and the idea of this sort of polytheistic God. So the monsters, so you've sort of added this into the mix. We started with monsters that really weren't a religious tie-in
Right.
at all. So, I mean, do you have any thoughts on what were you thinking of when you were bringing in?
Well, when I wrote these books, I really wasn't like trying to examine like faith that much
Right.
and religion. What I find quite interesting is how people use power and how it changes them. And religion is basically the ultimate power. If you have a God on your side, you can do whatever you want, so long as you follow that God's rules. And so when it came to the monsters in these faiths, one of the things that I wanted to look at is these monsters are to a certain extent an expression of what the people feel like they want or deserve. And so it's this question of, if you could dream up anything with your God, why would you pick this? I mean, but that's something you see in a lot of faiths. You know, there's always Satans and monsters and all sorts of horrible things waiting for us. So I thought it was kind of interesting to look at that perspective, and you just kind of wonder, why would you include this? Why would you like make this real in your life? And what does that say about you, that you feel like you need to have this monster whose sole purpose is to punish you for doing bad things and to have a hell in its belly. It's interesting. I think that one of the things that like people do in religion and in power is they express like their values in ways that they don't intend to. There's a lot of punishment going on. Then you could look at it for the one hand and say, okay, so we're wrong and we're doing bad things. But from a different perspective, it implies that God is always thinking about you because you're very important. And he wants you to do these things just the right way. And he's watching everything that you do, which I think assigns a lot of importance to you. It means that you think you're worth watching all the time. And I frankly don't think people are that interesting to me, let alone God, who's got stars and the sky and planets and things like that. So it's just kind of funny, and that was one way to examine that aspect of people.
I liked it too because it was, as I said, it's polytheistic, and it's these different city-states, and it's a way of, it reminded me of sort of the Greek and Roman polytheistic, where there's a lot of politics.
Right.
And there's a lot of sort of little backbiting things that these gods get involved with, and they get involved with the people. And I find especially with this Divine Cities trilogy, it's very much part of the landscape. It is literally part of the landscape. Yeah. Right. And landscape is something I also like to talk about, because I think in everything that I've read of yours so far, landscape is really a character. Yeah. Very visual. And like when I write stuff like that, I always kind of so when you write fantasy, there's this urge to world build, which is to make cool stuff for the purpose of it being cool. Right. So you have these like magic systems, and you want to talk about how their shoes are special, and talk about clothing, and whatever. And the rule that I have is that if you include an aspect of the world in the story, it's got this cool little rule or sort of like a facet of how that world works. Right. It needs to speak to the theme of the story somehow or in some fashion. If it's about history or power or anything like that, it needs to examine that to some degree. And so when it comes to landscape, you see this city that has all these broken pieces of history where it's all schizophrenic and it's all over the place and nothing makes sense anymore. It kind of acts as sort of a grand metaphor for the way that the world now feels to these people. And in Wink, in America and elsewhere, it is a green place in the middle of the desert that is just not authentic, it's invented. And I think that speaks to our idea of happiness, and that it's something that we made up. It's not something that exists naturally, it's something that we chose. Again, it's our values like expressing themselves in weird ways. And I think that in American Elsewhere, it's a very invented city for this, it feels, and that's in a very American kind of thing to do, right? To build these prefabbed communities, and then just you plug yourself in, and there's your happiness. Yeah, and that was one thing that I read about, about these labs that they did, where they basically had to build a town out there, and it just felt really weird to just all of a sudden be like, here's your city. It's just out of nowhere, and I was like, that must feel very strange. And if you had to do it, how would you do it, and how would it feel? Right. And why not, try go all out, and try and make the perfect little quaint town. Right, right. Yeah, and it's excellent that way. So in reading these also, and I have to confess, I'm not a super traditional fantasy lover, which is great because these are not that. Right. Beards and swords and chains. Right. Yeah. And those are in this, but I really enjoy these in that you just seem to really refresh the fantasy trope. So there, you got your swords and your horses, and you got your battles, and you got your cool airships or just sturdy sailing ships. But was there? I mean, how do you? I'm not sure how to. How do you go about making those decisions of how to update the tropes and still keep it, still satisfy your reader? Or maybe I should ask, if you've gotten any blowback of this was not, what I expected. I wanted Gandalf, and somewhat. I mean, usually I think that if someone is expecting it to be straight fantasy, they're not going to get that far in the book.
So I can't disappoint them because they're only going to read 10%. And that's fine, yeah. But I think that what works for those people is Sigrid, who's there basically to service all those needs. You know, you want your big tough alpha male to punch stuff and stab stuff and do cool shit. That's his job. He's the dude who does cool shit in the book, and people love him. Yeah. And it's kind of funny because even I can't tell if I did that seriously. Like I had some people say, you know, you were really kind of, it's a joke that you played on this, and that he's like the fantasy protagonist, but in this book he's the secretary, and he does all the cool fantasy stuff, but he's again the secretary, and it's like he feels almost like parody, and I was like, huh, you're making me sound pretty smart there. Maybe? I don't know. So, but yeah, I think it's interesting because to me, because you know, I don't read a lot of straight fantasy because the tropes get so familiar that, you know, it's like bricks. You see them put together and you see them, because once you start writing, reading becomes a whole lot less fun. It's just a lot less fun. And you start to look at everyone's books and you're like, I've seen this before, because you're not reading for pleasure. I mean, it happens very rarely that I read for pleasure anymore. I read to steal new shit. So I'm always like when I read a book, I'm always like scanning it, trying to see if there's anything new in here. And if there's not, then I stop reading it. Right. And so what is usually very successful, I find, is stuff that is like, there's some amount of tropes that are very familiar, 40 to 70% stuff you've seen. And so the stuff that I read normally, which is, you know, like I do weird literary crap, this is like super genre-y to me. It's like, you know, super pulpy. I think it's a pulpy book, you know, and that it does all the usual like old fantasy stuff. But to people who are really like into the, who are really deep in the genre, they're like, this is the strangest thing that I've ever read. And I'm like, really? Okay. Well, I think, you know, it's kind of, you know, a fantasy pot boiler a little bit.
That's the appeal for me, is because it's got the pacing of pulp. You know, because the fantasy, I bog down as well when I'm reading a straight up fantasy where it's just like, you know, oh, there's going to be world building for 30 pages and nothing's, you know, like I open the tome which explains all that, let me explain, you know, and I'm just like, I just don't have the time for that anymore. Right. So these, you know, you keep the pace going, but you have the fantasy elements. The other thing is you are constantly introducing new technologies into the world.
And that was something, that was a choice I made, because these books are really about change in a culture and the world and how people deal with change. Something that's pertinent to right now. But, and so one of the things that is rough with old fantasy is that when you got your beards and your swords and your kings, it is implied to a certain extent that things have been like that for thousands upon thousands of years. Like in Tolkien, I think it was tens of thousands of years with the elves and whatnot. And that's just not how human society works. I mean, it's been 1,000 years, 2,000 years, things have changed significantly. So I really wanted to capture that aspect, and so these are sort of set in the early 20th century, like 1905. It starts out in 1905, 1910, and then in City of Miracles, like it continues, and it's about 1940 is how it feels. But it's advanced incredibly quickly, where all those like ages with the beards and the swords and stuff is really not that long ago for them, and it's because they've had, you know, they had gods and the gods died, and in the place of those gods came technology in the market and the world that we sort of know more, and it advanced incredibly quickly because they had used, I don't want to get too into world building, but they had used these old divine tools to nose out the scientific principles, which took us thousands of years to do. So that's how they got cars in like 100, 200 years. But yeah, there's a lot of change and it's very fast, and I think that that's, you know, the heart of the book is suddenly realizing that the world gets incredibly small extremely quickly and not knowing how to deal with that.
Yeah.